You know, we talked about this morning the importance of identifying violence as a public health problem. We talked about the need for creating a public safety ecosystem. And we heard about the importance of visioning something different from what we have. We also talked about that an important component of developing an ecosystem is resourcing it and making sure that it's properly funded. I am Pat Clark, the Chief Program Officer for the Fund for Nonviolence. Thank you. The Fund for Nonviolence has been a long-time supporter and proud supporter of Equal Justice USA. And I wanted to say that I know that EJUSA is a really important partner for the work that's happened in Newark, but in our experience of our journey, FNV's journey with EJUSA, we've had conversations with them way before the work here in Newark around breaking the cycle of trauma, about being violence interrupters. And in some ways, I would say that some of that work has been groundbreaking. It was through Equal Justice USA that we were introduced to the Hub, and we became a supporter of the work of the Hub. And so we know that it's really important for groups like EJ to help identify other partners and help us understand the work as a whole. We really believe in the importance of sustainability, and that was a question that kept coming up in the first panel, is how do we sustain this work? Well, a very important part of that is by resourcing it. And we heard that the need here is great. We know that the opportunity is great, and now it's a matter of how do we maximize this opportunity. And I want to say that we have some amazing funding experts on this panel who will talk about their work and who will help us understand some of the ways that this funding can happen. And this includes government agencies, it includes private funders, and it includes foundations. I'm honored to be able to moderate this panel and introduce these experts to you. Our first person is Eddie Bocanegra, who's a senior advisor for community violence intervention with the Department of Justice. He formerly served as the director of Ready Chicago, a leading gun violence prevention program, and prior to that, as an outreach worker for the gun violence prevention program, Ceasefire. Eddie, do you want to just lift your hand? We also have with us Lakeisha Ure, who's the director of the Newark Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery. A native of Newark, Director Ure has worked as a licensed clinical social worker, violence interrupter, and change agent. Next, Stephanie Greenwood is the Senior Strategy Officer for Economic Justice at Victoria Foundation. For the last 15 years, her work has focused on Newark at Victoria and as a member of the City Newark's Economic and Housing Development Department, and later as the city's Sustainability Director. And finally, Walter Katz is the Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures. He served 17 years as a public defender and later as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Public Safety in the Administration of Chicago, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, where he was co-negotiator of the Chicago Police Department's consent decree, and he led the design and development of the new Office of Violence Prevention. Welcome, panelists. I want to thank each of you for being here, and I want to start off by asking you the question, what brought you to this work? And we'll just start in order.
This way?
This way, right.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Keisha Ure, Director for the Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery. I don't know if I was brought to this work or the work was brought to me, right? Some of us don't have a choice in the work, that it just kind of becomes who you are. And I think for me, it just comes very naturally as a charge. I come to this work by way of activism. by way of being a social worker, but by way of experiencing violence and crime in the city, born and raised in the city of Newark, and ultimately having people shot and killed in the city, and there was no outrage. There was no outcry. There was no strategies. There was no resources. There was no one behind a yellow tape to say, hey, let me help you. There was no support in the hospital room. So those things weren't there. And so for me, I decided that I wanted to be a part of the change, that I wanted to be the person that don't have to experience that by themselves. And so for me, the story goes that I had someone to come and knock on my door, to come and shoot my brother. And I answered the door, and I spoke to the person, not knowing what their intention was. And so the person asked me questions, is your brother home? He was asleep at the time. And the next morning, my brother left out to go pick up his daughter, and the guy tried to put him in the trunk, and, you know, they got into a scuffle. He ran, but they still shot him. And someone came to knock on the door and say, your brother just got shot down the street. And so luckily, he survived, but when we had the conversation, it was the same person who knocked on the door. And to know that the person knocked on the door that time, nothing was going to stop them from coming back to knock on the door a second time. And so overnight, I had to up and move out the city. And that's traumatic when you have to leave everything that you know behind. A house that I lived in for over 20 years from my childhood, having to just up and go. And so being that person, right, vicariously, not directly affected, but now I no longer feel safe. I no longer know if this person is going to come back. There were no resources. There was no victims of crime compensation. There was no victim advocates during that time. This is 2001, maybe. And so for me, having that experience, that was my first experience, but I had guys that I dated shot and killed, and there was no police response that was empathetic. It was stand behind a yellow line, we'll talk to you when we talk to you. There was no, hi, is there someone that can help me? There was none of those things. The detectives was just trying to do their work. The prosecutors was just not trying to do their job because I gave them the information. They told me it was hearsay, and no one was prosecuted. And so the systems, right, brought me to this work. The broken systems, the continued broken systems, the continued failure of the systems that we pay or that we confide in to help us has continued to fail us. That's what's brought me to the work.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Thank you. Good morning. Stephanie Greenwood at the Victoria Foundation, really honored to be here on behalf of Craig Drinkard, our executive officer. And Victoria Foundation, as a funder of community-based public safety work, I think what brought us as an organization into this space was really part of a shift the foundation has been trying to make as a whole, being about 100 years old since the 60s, place-based here in Newark, and recently having adopted a new mission and framework. I think really that in part grew out of our learning from the community-based public safety work to be more grounded in and accountable to the community where we are place-based. We started funding public safety in a different model in around 2010, 2011. The mayor mentioned this morning that a statistic that 2% of the people are responsible for 70, 80% of the violent incidents, and the model that was brought to us and that we funded for a number of years really, I mean, I'm putting it crudely, but it took the approach of those folks are the problem. Get those 2% out of the community, lock them up, and you'll see the numbers come down. And it was academically grounded, data-driven, evidence-based, kind of all of the philanthropic buzzwords, and we funded it for a number of years. And it wasn't effective. And we started to see that it wasn't effective. And I think a couple things allowed us to make that mental model shift. The mayor came in with his vision in 2014 with his lived experience, his relationships, his political philosophy, that it's not the people, it's the systems, right, that are causing and contributing to these cycles. We also had board member shifts on our board, and some longtime board members starting to question and point out, hey, what is this doing? What are we doing with what was for us a pretty big grant? When we had staff, Craig Drinkard, then senior program officer, who had his own lived experience with these issues coming up in the West Ward and having the relationships that he had, and he started to develop a relationship of trust with Akila Sherrills. And And that trust and that relationship really became the basis of going to our board to say, we have to move our resources. We have to make a shift in what we're funding to a different model and a different approach that looks at trauma and healing and prevention primarily. And so in the early years, I will say it was, in that first year, I just looked before coming here at our internal report, and you could see the friction in our internal culture because the report says, yeah, they're, the street team, the Newark Community Street. So we were able to move with our board a first grant of $125,000 to seed the Newark Community Street team, 2015, and bring some other funders along with us. And that first report said, okay, yeah, they're out there, they're doing this incredible work, they're risking their safety, they're saving lives, but they didn't send us the written report on time. And the metrics aren't there, and the benchmarks aren't there. And so, you could see this sort of culture friction with the foundation sort of needing to lean on that trust and that relationship and move away from this kind of distanced academic approach to the issue. And again, I really feel like we learned from that mental model shift and those relationships, and like any relationship, it's reciprocal. Both parties are changed, right? Like we try to impact the ecosystem, but the ecosystem changes us as an organization. And Craig Drinkard is now our executive officer. Akila is on our board, and we have recently adopted a new mission that explicitly calls for us to move resources in support of Black and brown residents in Newark to build community power, foster economic justice, and support youth self-determination. So we know we're early in that work, and we're just really honored to be in relationship with the people in this room and continue to learn from you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm Walter Katz, Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures, and we're really honored to be supporting this convening that is taking place over these 2 days and to support the distribution of this amazing report that was assembled to tell the story of Newark, which is not just a story of today, but just such an important historical document to really put the spotlight on the reality that the conditions that Black and brown communities experience today are not in a vacuum. They're not detached from history. The history of Newark is very much a history of 1967 and before 1967. So that report really just amplified that, and I really appreciate that. Arnold Ventures, I'll be really brief about that. I'll focus more on what brought me to this work. But, we began this journey of thinking more about how can we reduce violent crime or be helpful in reducing violent crime around in 2019, when we started developing and thinking about it and having conversations with our board. How do we decrease victimization that concentrates, as we talked earlier today, in people and places? How do we increase community involvement to decrease this trust gap so that community members feel listened to, that they actually can be involved into solving the violence problem within their communities? How might we do so in a way that lifts up both community voice, at the same time also taps into those right resources, which don't only rely upon, handcuffs and the police, right? And so that was really our motivation. For me, myself, I didn't get into the world of philanthropy in a traditional way. As you said at the very beginning, I was a public defender for 17 years. For 15 years, I was in Los Angeles County. And in my experience, I tried about maybe 75 jury trials, and of those, maybe about, I lost count, about how many were homicides, 15, 16 homicides, maybe 20 homicide trials. And after a while, I just realized, well, I have a particular memory of having lunch in my office one day, working at my desk, and I had 3 open homicide cases. All 3 of my clients were 19 years old, and I had this sudden insight that no matter how far I go along in my career as a public defender, how old I get, my clients will always be 19 years old. And I couldn't take it anymore about only taking one piece at a time. The other thing that motivated me is this realization as a representative of my clients, especially for young men who were then convicted or went to trial and were in California would get these extreme sentences, that I was often the very last person on the outside who would physically touch them, ever, for the rest of their lives. And that really compelled me to try to see how can I impact systems at a greater scale. Long road, ended up here doing philanthropic work, but definitely was a convoluted path.
Thank you.
Good morning or afternoon. Keep forgetting what time zone I'm in right now. But Eddie Bocanegra, Senior Advisor to the Assistant Attorney General, the Office of the Department of Justice with OJP. So I want to share two quick thoughts here. The first one is, I remember in 2005 sitting across a coffee table with my brother, and he was wearing his Army uniform. He was a combat vet. He was one of 4 siblings, one of 3 actually, who served in the armed forces. And I remember looking at his left lapel, and he had these amazing ribbons. He was a sergeant. He was an E6, and highly decorated. And he was telling me the story about how he was in school, and the military police kind of took him out of the class and said, "Hey, we've been looking for you. You're being redeployed." And so here he is, early 20s, getting sent back to Iraq. And it was during the second tour that he got injured, and there's another story behind that. But as I'm looking at my brother, and he's telling me about what each one of those ribbons meant, he started telling me about the 32 missions he was part of. I couldn't help but to wonder, first, how proud I was of my brother, who was much younger than I am. And I was looking at his ribbons and thinking to myself, wow, our country validates a particular kind of violence. And as he stands up and we're parting ways, I looked at my uniform. And ironically, same kind of color pants with a light blue shirt. And in my left lapel, I had an ID that said, Eddie Bocanegra, B75782, Illinois Department of Corrections. So at the time, I was serving 29 years for a first-degree gang-related murder. I went to prison in 1994 when I was 18 years old, very similar to the age range that Walter just mentioned. I had a 10th grade level of education. I came to a home where, even though I had both parents, a very abusive home. When I say I forgot to mention I'm from the west side of Chicago, and I want to emphasize the west side. Too often people say I'm from Chicago. I'm from the north side, or I'm from the suburbs. That doesn't count in Chicago, by the way. So, and I was involved in the street gangs at a very young age because I witnessed someone shot and killed at the age of 13. And that should have scared me away, but it didn't. Because I also knew what gangs represented in my community. And what they represented was what I know now as the falseness of hope, but really a brotherhood between individuals that struggle, that look alike, and that often society has kind of marginalized. The second part of why I say this, right, why I share that story, it was that conversation with my brother that he witnessed a lot of my own trauma. We were exchanging stories of combat. And it's in that conversation that I realized, even though I'm not justifying what I did, I struggle with the fact that my community and society did not validate what I had to navigate to go to school, going block by block. And I had to go to church where my uncle was a pastor, and I had to carry a gun with me at 15 years old. So think about it. Here I go to church, go to pray, and I got a gun on me because the minute I come out, people are going to recognize me. But the other part, and the most important part that I would say what brought me to this work, is finding the sense of atonement and forgiveness. And I've been very public with my life, as shameful as embarrassing it is to share with you what I went to prison. I've done so to be able to challenge people's perception of people like myself. Because I'm also a graduate of a top university. I've visited many countries. I've sat in various boards. I sat with Walter as he was working on some of the police reform there, particularly as it relates to looking for, I forgot what it was, Walter, that Office of Police, COPA. Yeah. Sorry. And so there's many accolades that I would say that I've had in my career, and I'm very humble about many of these things. But I would also say that, again, I have 7 kids, and I live in a zip code where my kids are going to go to a top high school. They're going to receive some of the best education. My neighbors are doctors and professors and so on. And the communities that I've worked in the last 13, 14 years of my life, I want them to have what I currently have and have much more than what I have. Because they're better people than I am as well. And so unfortunately, because of the zip code they're born into, really determines their outcomes in life. and the options they actually have or the access they have. And so I'm here today representing the Department of Justice to be a bridge also between the federal government and the folks in this room. And I hope that in my capacity, I continue to bring your voice into these spaces to champion the things that we are discussing today and was discussed yesterday. So thank you.
Thank you. As you can well tell, we have a brilliant panel to learn from, to engage with. So my next question is for Director Ure. In your role as Director of Newark's new Office of Violence and Prevention and Trauma Recovery, you are on the front lines of both making grants to community groups and then seeing up close the impact of those funds are having on the community. Can you share one or two success stories from your local funding?
So as the mayor stated when he was here earlier, and I don't know, so let me just say a little bit about the Office of Violence Prevention and how it became. So the Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery was born out of the wake of the George Floyd protests around the rallying cries of defunding of the police. And nationally, everyone was saying they wanted to defund the police brutality, and during that time is when we learned that law enforcement and public safety have the biggest budgets everywhere. And then we also knew that the people who were on the grounds, like doing the work, had no budgets. And so this is, the time. So many of us know this work and have been doing this work, but then started to connect the dots around that time. And so we talk about how law enforcement can't do this work alone. Is when we decided that for the Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery, the mayor signed an executive order, and we needed to, get community involvement and community input and really push the city council to be able to pass this through. And so when we got the Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery, we reallocated 5% of the police department's budget, and during that time, their budget was maybe $230 million. And so 5% of that is about $11.5 million, and in creating an Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery, which is a good investment because in other places it's tokenism, right? That they don't really do the investment. They gave us a building, one of the police precincts, and the residents weren't happy about that. So, as we tell the stories, we know what we're trying to do, but all the time, the decisions that we make, the community don't always see the benefit in it. And so they closed the police precinct over on 17th Avenue and in the Central Ward, and the residents were very upset. But ultimately, they did build another one next to it so that the residents can have somewhere to go. So we have the police precinct. We are making it a conflict resolution museum. Will be on the first floor of it, and we have outreach workers, social workers, victim advocates, because we don't have places to go in the community. So a lot of times there's not space. So we're fighting for space, we're fighting for funding, we're fighting for all the resources all the time when law enforcement and other entities don't have to have those fights. And so under the Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery, brought together domestic violence, sexual violence, community violence under one umbrella. And ultimately, the Office of Violence Prevention is the clearinghouse for these community-based organizations. So we have Newark Community Street Team, Newark Anti-Violence Coalition, Newark Street Academy, The Hub, Newark Community Solutions, Hospital-Based Violence Intervention Program, Beth Israel Hospital, Newark Police Department, The Hub. So we have about 16 to 18, My Brother's Keeper, Equal Justice USA. So we have about 16 to 18 community-based organizations coming together to coordinate and have accountability in the community for this work. And so what we were missing is the coordination piece. And so now coming together to be able to do that, and what we heard is we don't have resources, we don't have funding, and we're going to the same funders, Victoria Foundation, Healthcare Foundation, Prudential, Panasonic, the different corporations, and then some of them didn't even have that. They don't know how to get funding, go after funding, private foundations versus state versus federal, and even the capacity to manage those entities. And so that's ultimately how we now understand that we need to collaborate, partner, coordinate, and have accountability, and have funders at the table, right? And so for me, it was change, it was a change for me when I went to Detroit, and they had a symposium, and we had it at a place where the funders at their building, because many of us think that funders are just funders, right? We don't see them as people. We don't see that we can have relationships with them. We don't think that we can talk to them. We don't think that we can get ideas from them. And it's not a two-way street. It's not a two-way relationship. It's really just one-sided. And when I went to Detroit and we had this symposium and I saw that they allowed us to use their space and that they were at the table and they gave us information and they were like people, I was like, whoa, right? We need to go knock on Victoria's door and Healthcare Foundation's door and speak to people in real life. Hi, Lisa, how are you, right? And so really having relationship and learning that funding sources and resources is the key to being able to do real work. And many of our organizations are underfunded, undersupported, underpaid, underrepresented, all of those things. And so now coming from being an activist, a person who's been doing social work, managing a Shani Baraka Center, the West Ward Victims Outreach Program. We started with the DOJ grant and getting private foundation money and public money and learning these systems, we begin to now say that we need to have real stake in this. We need to be at the table. And now for me to be a funder is game-changing and hard all at the same time, right? Because now I get to be held accountable at a different place, right? I don't get to have conversation when I say, hey, the RFP is out, and then y'all call me, I say, I can't talk to you, right? Please don't call me while the grant is open, while the RFP is open. I cannot have a conversation with you, right? And so it's a hard place, and it's a different place to go from doing the work, being a direct service person, being the healer in the community, being everything, to now being a funder, to being a person who's putting money back into the community, but having a real stake in it because I understand why it's important, and excited to give the money back, and want to give the money back, and I'm going to fight to give the money back, and I'm going to keep fighting because this is a fight because now it's political. Right? And while I didn't know that before, you go from being grassroots to being on the political side, it's a hard place. And when you have community at the center of everything that you do, and you have to go out into the community and see them every day, the accountability is just a different place. And so while I am excited about being a funder, I am tired as well. And I am exhausted. But it's a place of growth and development, and I'm learning. But I am committed to putting the money back. I'm committed to redistributing the money. I'm committed to being the clearinghouse. I'm committed to making sure that these organizations get the funding that they need to get, because if we don't, then it's on the shoulders of us who know the problem. And so we have a hot summer coming, and we know that we need to be able to get these organizations funding so that they can do their work at its best place. So your question was, give you a a success story. I am still working on the success story to get this funding now. I am in the process of City Council passing the $1 million for me to get out the door to these organizations. I have another $19 million that I'm trying to get out the door in the next couple months. So I have the plans, I have everything ready to go, but I'm in the process of getting things approved to get the money out the door. But we did award 8 organizations $1 million. We are going to put out another $19 million for a $20 million investment. We have given Newark Community Street Team some funding during COVID time to be able to help us do violence intervention in the streets and high-risk intervention work. So I have the makings of success stories.
Yeah, I was just going to say, look.
I have the makings of success stories, but the success is being here, right?
Yeah.
The office has only been around 2 years. I took the place 1 year ago, right? To have social workers. So for every 10 police officers that get hired, I get to hire 1 social worker. So changing policies, right? Those are my success stories, right? So changing policies. We put 100 officers in, so I got to hire 10 social workers. We just put in another 65 officers. I get to hire another 6 social workers. So being able, and they are in the police precincts. So all the social workers are in the precincts. outreach workers. So being able to change policy and shift the work is some of the success.
Yeah, Lakeisha, you are the success story here. And we so appreciate your work. One follow-up question for you. Do you think the success in Newark is unique to Newark, or do you think that there are possibilities of this being realized in other communities?
I think that there's a possibility for it to be realized in other communities. Newark historically is a city of activism and push, right? They are a city of major pride. So when you say, where you from, they're going to say the mighty, mighty Southboard, right? They're going to tell you where they're from with pride. They love this place. They don't care how much crime, violence, they don't care what you say about it. So this city is filled with pride. And so it's the heart of the people that make it unique. It's the heart of the people that makes it, because the mayor comes from that place, right? The mayor before him and the mayor before him, right, come from a place. And so while we are doing game-changing and groundbreaking work, we have excellent leadership that helps us and to be able to do that and pushes it without apology, right? So you need people who are not apologetic, who understands the issues, who understands that we can't do things business as usual, that we can't do things in a vacuum. And so when you have leadership that's bold, then it forces you to be bold. When you have leadership that understands, then it forces you to understand differently. And so we know that other cities are looking at our work, that we are modeling this work. And while it's not perfect, I think we certainly are ahead of the game in so many places where we have funders, community-based people, law enforcement, institutions, residents, our professionals, city government at the table, right? And so it's hard to get everyone at the table at the same time and to have a community-based public safety approach to this work and have law enforcement buy into it is amazing. So when we can call the police director and he answers the phone, hey, Keisha, how are you? I'm good, Brian. This is what I need. Okay, no problem. When you can have that kind of relationship with the police director, the police chief, all the way down, right, is important. And they come to things. They show up. They share information. That part you don't get. Law enforcement normally don't share, right? And so to be able to share data, to be able to talk at the table, to have meetings every other week with them, to be able to say, what's the strategy? And when the mayor says in our meeting, okay, we need the public safety report out, it's Keisha and Brian. It's not just Brian, right? And so to have that shared approach is the culture shift, and we're shifting the narrative, and that's what I think is unique for Newark.
Great, thank you, thank you. Stephanie, you are Victoria's Senior Strategy Officer for Economic Justice. Economic justice isn't always front of mind when people consider public safety. What do you see as the connection?
You know, something that was said on the earlier panel is ringing in my ear, which is that safety is not just the absence of violence, but it's the presence of thriving, right? And so I guess I was thinking about this question because to me they're so inextricably linked, right? Safety and prosperity. And with this frame about violence as a public health issue, it seems clear that poverty is public violence, right? Like poverty and economic injustice are public violence structured by policy, intentionally put in, and that there's sort of the disinvestment that we see in Newark neighborhoods, as the poet spoke to us about this morning. The flip side of that coin is wealth extraction, is what's sort of a buzzword in progressive philanthropy right now is racialized capital, right? Racialized capitalism, that there's this kind of, people are making money, it's profitable to separate communities and exploit the real estate in certain communities and separate Black and brown residents particularly from economic opportunities. So, I mean, I think we're developing an analysis around that and using this healing model, again, thinking about, okay, well, if poverty is economic violence, we need to think about healing and repair work in an economic sphere. Like, what does that mean at an individual and family level in terms of wealth creation and support for wealth creation, but also at the level of policy and resource redistribution, as the director mentioned. Like, what does it mean to do economic healing work through resource redistribution. And so, I mean, I'll just lift up 2 examples that come to mind. And I should say we're really early in our strategy development with this new frame. But if you think about housing as one issue, sort of one way this shows up, and I have to say, Solomon, I've learned a lot from you on this issue and your work and the street team's work. Most people in Newark, just an absolute majority of people are housing cost burdened. They're paying more than 1/3 of their income for housing. In a lot of neighborhoods, it's more like 60, 70% income for housing, leaving very little for other necessities. So there's housing cost burden. There's also a very high eviction rate in Newark. There's a lot of churn and shift in the housing market. One of the ways I'm learning from the street team is that they're helping lead a project called Newark Stays. That's a community-based eviction prevention project. And housing condition, because the disinvestment is really poor. So there's health impacts on children. There's just kind of quality of life and stress impacts from having to deal with this. And so thinking about housing as a lever for economic justice and economic repair, I learned, again, from the street team that housing is cited as a major factor for a lot of the people that are showing up at the Trauma Recovery Center. They mention housing as a major causal factor for why they're there. And as well, and we don't talk about this enough, it's a factor for child removal and for family separation, and talk about trauma, right, and cycles of trauma and stress. So we know we need to invest in housing justice if we're going to address public safety. And then it's almost so obvious that it's hard to see, but we need to invest in worker justice and in jobs, right, and access to living wage jobs, to jobs with stable, predictable hours, safe conditions, health care, and also respect and dignity. I mean, that's something that's a source of stress, right, again, for a lot of people. And so we're starting to learn from peer foundations around the country about investment strategies in worker justice and in the ability of workers to move toward living wages and healthcare, not just at the individual level in terms of training and workforce development, but at the worker justice level of collective organizing and support for improved conditions in whole sectors. So those are just 2 of the examples that I'll cite. We know this is a long game, right? And that we need to be thinking at multiple levels, that individual, the neighborhood, and the community-wide level. But we're looking forward over the next few years, again, to learning with all of you and to learning from peer foundations around the country and to really starting to invest deeply our own strategies and try to bring along peer foundations, because we don't have enough resources. And even in all of private philanthropy here, we don't have enough resources. We need to be in partnership with the public sector. We need to be in partnership with the private sector to say, okay, all of us need to be part of this resource shift toward economic justice and toward healing.
Great, thank you. Walter, you have over 2 decades of experience in public service, including as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Public Safety in the administration of Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, to oversee the enforcement of the Chicago Police Department's consent decree and developing an Office of Violence Prevention. How does your experience with city government and with law enforcement inform your current work as a funder?
Well, thank you for that question, and I think it does on almost a daily basis. I think what it brought with that experience are the very challenges that Lakeisha was talking about. And for me, success really depends on being able to do 3 things. The first, of course, is leadership, right? If your leadership is weak on the governing side, you're not going to get very far. The second is governance. And what do I mean between leadership and governance? What are the structures that are in place? For example, budgeting, right? I think to a great extent, there's a default, for example, that the police department is going to capture somewhere from 30 to 45% of most municipalities' budgets. The city of Chicago, for example, when I was there, the budget was about $1.5 billion per year for the Chicago Police Department. I think since then that has climbed in this year's budget, I don't follow it this closely anymore, to about $1.7 billion, right? But then I'm hearing Lakeisha talking about, well, I get 1 social worker for each 10 officers. Well, I guarantee you that the salaries and benefits for those 10 officers is probably better than that for the social worker, right? And what is the governance system that's behind it? Well, behind that, the governance system is a collective bargaining system, which gives a lot of power to police unions who can continuously bargain upwards for more benefits and better wages and be able to trade off accountability, for example, for better benefits. You want us to wear body-worn cameras? You're going to have to pay us more, right? That's how it works. Social workers don't have that same bargaining power. So it's leadership, it's governance structures, and the third is also community voice, right? And that is something I had to learn, I had to come to about the importance of that. Simply government and funders are just too far removed from the reality of where impact actually occurs, right? And you cannot hope to function correctly. You cannot find the right interventions, the right programs, if you're not listening to community, and you can't do so when you're just using your own language and making community fit their language to meet your needs. It has to actually be reversed in the other direction. So that's lessons I've taken from it. So, yeah.
That's great.
Last thing I do want to say is that this is going to sound incredibly rude, but I'm going to be leaving here in about 12 minutes because my board has a meeting scheduled for me starting at 12, and so that I'll be zipping out of this room into another room.
Okay, thank you. Eddie, the Biden administration has made unprecedented investments in community-based violence prevention and intervention work, including allocating $10 billion of American Rescue Plan funds for safety and violence prevention. The Department of Justice has made clear they have a role to play in supporting local community work through funding, research, and technical assistance. You have powerful, direct experience doing violence interruption work, and now are at the table to help disperse those Department of Justice funds. Can you speak to what you think it means that the Biden administration is placing such an emphasis on community-based violence prevention and intervention?
All right, so this is one of those places where I got to be careful what I say.
It is being recorded.
Exactly. No such thing. And so let me preface by saying this: because I'm at the Department of Justice, we have to adhere to even stricter regulations and rules in the way that we are able to share information. Having said that, I would tell you that I'm extremely pleased that we have a president, the current administration right now, who has prioritized CVI, who's recognizing that there are other levels of violence, gun violence, besides what we see in mass shootings in schools. Right. This is not to underplay that, it's not to minimize that, it's to say that there are communities such as in our backyard here and in the west side of Chicago and in other places that for too long, when you hear about 5 individuals, 10 individuals who were shot in a drive-by or whatever that is, it's never really perceived as a mass shooting. You know, it's black and black crime or brown and brown crime. And so to have a president that is acknowledging that and to acknowledge it through the lens of a public health approach, right, it's extremely critical. Which I also want to give a shout out to the social workers in this room, because as someone who's been trained in social work, I think it's important that we also look at social workers of how do we solve for some of the solutions beyond what we have currently historically have looked at, and this is no shade to anybody who has a criminology background or a sociology background, is that we also need other disciplines to help inform the approach that we need to be taking in this field. So having said that, and to your question, what I can speak more to right now as it relates to the ARPA and the $50 million that are under Department of Justice, OJP, here's what I'll say. About a year ago, there was a group of advocates that really pushed hard for ensuring that not only was there a $5.2 billion in the BBB plan, the Biden's plan, but that there was also language around ARPA. You see, ARPA, it's real money. To me, the other money was still monopoly money. Right? It had to go through a process, to which Walter pointed out. It has to go through a process to see if it gets vetted and whether it makes it or does it get cut. But the ARPA dollars, those are dollars that are accessible today to you. But here's what I would want to caution you around that, is that the language is both, to some extent, vague, but it's also, there is language there that talks about CVI. The question is, how are we defining CVI? And I heard earlier the comments about prevention and intervention work, right? Well, there is truth that a small percentage of people are driving the majority of the violence, and it's in concentrated communities in large. And yet, what we do is we go back to what's comfortable for us, what we call kind of a plug and play. So if there's money that we could use for ARPA to support gaps in our budgets with law enforcement or other social services, traditionally, that's where we put the money at. Versus looking at ARPA money and say, how do we expand the work that CVI workers, such as those here today, continue to do this work? And how do we use some of this money to really think about innovation? Now, the question is, is that this money is limited. So how much can we invest in innovation? And there are people that would argue against that. And I could see both sides of the fence behind that. So I want to just kind of share an opinion, my opinion, that I would say when it comes to ARPA, to think about and look at the language and the statute there of how the city of Newark could actually leverage those dollars. I'm assuming that they are, they're not, I don't know, right? But even other neighboring communities, the state and the county. And potentially to look at those dollars as it relates to CVI, how do you build capacity? Because just a few months ago, I ran one of the largest anti-violence programs in this country. It was a $20 million budget. 95% of my budget was for philanthropy. In Chicago, we have a coalition of funders called PSPC that they've invested over $100 million in the last 5 years in gun violence. And I was one of the core recipients behind that. So it made my job much easier not to have to constantly be hustling for money. Having said that, there was a study behind that. It was a randomized controlled trial study that hasn't existed in the past. And while I would say that study demonstrates some positive outcomes, it also outlines some of the challenges about doing studies or the population that we're working with. And what I mean by that is that in the position that I hold now with OJP and DOJ, is that I would say that we have done a very poor job in really articulating and defining what high risk really means. Because if we did, then our formula in the way that we give money, either in government or philanthropy, would need to shift. See, the average cost of my participants at Ready Chicago were $24,000 a year. It started off at $37,000, and slowly I was able to work it down, especially when you're implementing a new program. But traditionally, most government and philanthropy typically give you between $1,000 and at best, $5,000 per participant. So we need to think about how are we redefining high risk and the metrics behind that. And the formula that is required, right, to think about how do we support that population. So that's just one thing that I would say. And I want to tie it into the $50 million that we have right now at OJP. We were hoping for 100, we didn't get it. We were hoping the CDC would receive also 100. That did not happen. This is where your voice and your advocacy has to kick in. Not that it hasn't, but this is where the voice, a unified voice across this country needs to continue to happen. I would say that there are folks in this room who have been part of that, Akila being one of them. We need to continue to create voices, create an amplified approach to bring these voices to say we need more resources in these areas. These $50 million that we have right now, there's an open solicitation. I would encourage you, if you have not taken a look at it, it's under BJA, the Bureau of Justice Administration. We made things much easier now today so that our partners, right, both in government and nonprofits, could look at one location versus having to look through entire OJP programs for funding. They're centralized in one location. They're really focused on CVI. And the idea for these resources is to support, to a very small extent, the research, because we need to continue to develop this field to make the points of why it's important to invest in this work. The second thing is really about capacity building, is how do we continue to build the infrastructure of our organizations beyond supporting street-level organizations, or meaning the people who are doing this work. We need to do that. But Akila mentioned earlier, too, it's like the back office, right? So when I hear people talk about trauma-informed approaches, as an example, I have to really assess and look under that hood and say, like, what does this really mean to you? Because we define that very differently, and if you look carefully, there is no really policy and procedures that too often organizations actually have. So I would just say that's an area that if they don't have it, we should help build it out. So there's more that I could say, but I see my good friend Walter's about to take off. Walter, I want to pass the mic because you have any last comments as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Real briefly, I think Eddie's comments are really important and really well taken. And we think about that the cost of $24,000, what you did to get the cost down is amazing in Chicago. When we think about what the cost of gun violence is, actually $24,000 is almost nothing if you just replicate, if you just identify the 10,000 most vulnerable people. That's only $240 million. That's a drop in the bucket. The last thing I'll say is looking ahead, I think one of the more critical long-term issues, or medium-term issues at least, that governments need to be thinking about is that the last tranche of ARPA money was just released and was to the local government last month, right? That money has to be spent by the end of 2024, and governments need to start thinking now about what is going to start happening in 2025 when that ARPA funds will not be available anymore. And I think my prediction is, having done city budgets, is that it's going to be a mad scramble for all these different types of social service organizations and needs to say, I should come first. And it's going to be a real battle. So need to think through what are our community's priorities and to really start planning for 2025 now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have to
Thank you
go.
so
My
much, Walter. Really appreciate it. Okay, so this is a question for everyone. The Newark experience has made clear that building a public safety ecosystem works in keeping communities safe. While pieces of this work has been happening in Black and brown communities for decades, the idea of building ecosystems of public safety is relatively new and is very different from how public safety has traditionally been considered. How has this new approach changed how you consider your funding work? And we're going to start with Stephanie, just to change it up a little bit. We'll start with you, Stephanie.
How has this approach changed how we do our funding work? I think that the core of the change is a shift in mental model, almost a shift in metaphor, right? And it's really the shift from a sort of individualist understanding of problems to a systemic understanding of problems. That we are looking at dynamics that are systemic, that are produced intentionally through policy, and we have to think about resource mobilization in that context, in the context of what it costs to make systemic change, not can we fund an individual program to help an individual person, and kind of starfish by starfish think that we're going to shift this huge system. And so that's a kind of, I think, a zoom out in perspective. And also what Walter was just mentioning, how to think of resource mobilization in a prevention model. How much easier is it to spend the resources that we need to spend shifting the systems for prevention rather than continuing to spend the money that, as a society, we are spending on the symptoms of these systemic problems, on locking people up, on dealing with the fallout of poverty, on dealing with the fallout of segregation and systemic racism, because that has an enormous cost. So I think that the ecosystem metaphor is so powerful in a funder context because it helps to reframe the problem at the appropriate scale. And it helps us to think about what it means to be a part of an ecosystem, not outside looking in and tinkering as if we're puppeteers or architects, but acknowledging our place at a well-established table and taking leadership from the people that are most proximate to the issue to say, what do we need to learn? What do we need to understand? Help us shape our resource agenda. And ultimately, how do we make the resources, how do we move control over the resources to the communities that are most impacted and have experienced the most resource extraction? So I think that the ecosystem model sort of helps us with that journey from outsider to participant to sort of release of control of the resources, which is ultimately where we need to go.
Thank you. Eddie?
So it's kind of hard for me to answer that question because I've only been in government for about 4 months. So, but here's what I would say. In my previous job, and I'll tie it into what I'm doing now. So at Ready Chicago, we would receive these funds, and my job is to identify partners, and we would provide these resources back to them to implement this model. And so I'm going to say this with some sense of humor. I remember I left the YMCA, I was an ED there working with youth, we're on probation, and I went to Heartland, second largest nonprofit in the state of Illinois, to launch this initiative. And they were going to make a big press announcement. I said, don't do that just yet. And I remember that it was time sensitive because we had to get the study out, the pressure from the foundations. Oh my God. They were like, you got to start like yesterday. I'm like, how do you want me to build an RCT within within weeks or months, right? And build a team. So I step in, and the first thing that I did was like, well, who's applying for these resources? And so I remember when they were coming in one by one, CEOs, EDs with their board members, and they opened the door, and then I got introduced. Half of the people who walked into this room had these huge smiles, and when they saw me and I got introduced, those smiles turned upside down. And the reason why is because they knew that I knew that they were full of it. You see, doing street outreach, intervention work, working coalition, working collaborations, and so on, you know who's really doing the work and who's not.
Yeah, yeah.
And because there's a level of street cred that I was bringing to the space, like people couldn't debunk that or refute that, because as a kid in prison and as a professional, I would say that my integrity has been really intact. And so the same in this particular meeting, where they couldn't argue me with that. So at the end, I had to make some decisions around that, around who's going to get the resources and so on. And I would say that I came into the space criticizing, or critiquing, I should say, the field of CVI, particular street outreach, not because I did not think it was an essential, but because I believed it could be much more than what we were actually doing. And so that became a journey of the pull and take with some of our partners and some of the employer providers that we also connected with, to say, how do we elevate this field? Because the field of CVI is a very stagnant field. And we continue to look at two previous models, which I won't share out loud here, but I give a lot of credit to them as well, because they got us to where we're at right now. But we are unwilling to innovate, right? We're unwilling to take risk. And sometimes government, more so government, is unwilling to take that risk because of political backlashes, right? So for example, now if an outreach worker gets caught with a gun or gets indicted for drugs, we say, let's just, pull the money away. But we don't do the same for law enforcement. So this idea of public safety, right, is one that we have to continue to wrestle with and to redefine. And Walter mentioned something that's really important. The unions behind this. I want to be really careful about what I say that, but I want to just point out that there's tremendous opportunities for us to bring our very best and negotiate with the people that we're saying we're serving at front of our conversations.
Great, thank you. Lakeisha.
And so he spoke on something very important in terms of the political piece, and I didn't want to start there, but I want to address it in terms of how they don't do that to law enforcement. And so while we get 5% of the budgets or whatever it is, law enforcement get to mess up. They get to get lawsuits, they get to get cases, they get to get all of these things, and they funding don't get decreased every year, right? But on this end for us, we always scrambling, looking for funding, and if we mess up, if we get our formerly incarcerated folks, our credible messengers, our folks that are not, they don't see it as professional work, right? They don't value the work. And they will take our funding away. They will say they don't deserve to be funded. They don't know how to write the documentation. They can't produce the reports. All of the red tape that we know goes into it. But the police can write a crappy report. They can do all of those things, right? And nothing happens, right? And so looking at that from a place of equity, because that's what I'm trying to build here, right? For community-based public safety and public safety, that there's some equity. If the police director get this, then I want this too. If the police department get this, then I want this too. They get 100 cars, I want 100 cars too. They get to make $200,000, I want to make $200,000 too, because we are first responders. We are on the front lines too. We are at the hospital, we at the funeral, we at the school, we at the house, we at all of those things right alongside with them. And while I'm not, making the comparisons in that place, but that's the place that we're working towards, the equity place, and seeing our work as valuable, putting our lives on the line. When we go in these communities, 9 times out of 10, we have more information already than the police have. And so we walk a tight line in terms of, do we give it, do we share it, do we not? How do we inform the work? And so from a place of, for me, and now being quote unquote a funder, looking and being more intentional with more information. And so doing it from a place of community where we have Brick City Peace Collective, that nonprofit organizations that know the work that's been out here as well get to be a passer through for the funding. They get to be at the table as well. And so while we talk about the ecosystem, many of us know this ecosystem. We've been in it, but now the language is changing. And some of us are not going to follow with the language. Some of us already have fallen out with the language. As we say, we're in this ecosystem. We're like, what ecosystem? We in this shit. We in this work, right? We in this work, and that's how we identify people who are grassroots, people who are boots on the ground, identify it, right? And so us labeling it and not losing people and leaving people behind because we go from ground zero to 5,000 feet to 15,000 feet, and some of us are at 30,000 feet. And I appreciate the people at 30,000 feet because I can't see that high sometimes. So I call on Mark and Will and different people who are at 30,000 feet because I'm at 15 and sometimes 5. And I say, what's the landscape? What's going on? How can we inform this work differently? But we have to see that some of us are not at those levels. And if we're not valuable, right? All of it is valuable. And so doing this work more intentionally from a place of being a funder, CVI work being stagnant, I took that note. And being intentional and the stigma, we have to destigmatize the work. We have to stop having the stigma on people that we're not professionals, that we're not valuable, and pushing and having the community voice and allowing their voice to be monumental and at the center of the work.
Thank you so much. Before we open up for questions, I want to thank these incredible panelists for joining us today and to thank you for your incredible work. I can't believe how fast the time is going. We're going to try to get in a couple of questions, but I'm not Will Campbell, so I don't have the latitude to stretch this out a little bit more. I wanted to say that I am honored to represent the Fund for Nonviolence in terms of being a part of this movement of funders investing in building and sustaining the ecosystems to address violence, specifically violence as a public health issue. It's clear from the first panel, from this panel, and I'm sure from the next panel, that there are some amazing things that are happening here in Newark, and that there's the potential for even more to happen. There's the potential for more expansion. The need is great, but the opportunities are great. And so we want to invite those of you who are funders to take advantage of the opportunities to do the right thing and invest in Newark and to use Newark as an example of what can be done in other places to expand and to replicate the work. I'm happy to share the reasons why we at Fund for Nonviolence are so high on Equal Justice USA, so high on groups like HUB, and so high on groups that understand that to do this work means to envision something different from what we've done in the past. And we can't wait any longer for people to catch up with folks who are doing what is necessary in Newark. We need to help give them a hand up. I also just want to emphasize again what Lakeisha and other people have said about the importance of relationships. We cannot do this work if we're not in relationship with the people who are most adversely affected by the issues and the problems. We cannot do this work if we're not elevating those people to take the lead and speak to what is necessary. And so I think that's absolutely critical. So I think I'm going to be able to get in a couple of questions. So the first one I'm going to ask is, how do we keep gentrification from becoming a strategy or a consequence of this work?
You see what she did there?
has decided that Stephanie will answer this question.
This is a powerful question. So a consequence, what came before consequence?
A strategy or a consequence of this work.
So investing in basically a displacement strategy, you're saying. So it's a profound question. I mean, we've seen this as a path of least resistance in other communities, right? As prosperity is built, the people who have held down the community for years and years and generations are pushed out. So thankfully, we have an administration that's committed on this issue with the Equitable Development Commission and with other kind of policy structures, but we know we're in a market, right? We're in a regional market. You may have seen a recent well-publicized report about the level of outside investors coming and buying up property in Newark, owning land in Newark. And so, I mean, if you're asking me, personal opinion, what this means is that we need to think hard about who owns the land. That we need to think hard about investing in structures of community ownership and community stewardship of land. Because if the community owns the city, then it's more resilient and resistant to the market forces that might come and try to push people out of their homes. And and there's a direct link to crime and violence. So, I mean, I think we need to be very careful and very thoughtful as we invest in economic development work, that we're building in that community ownership, community stewardship piece, and investing heavily as well in the capacity of the nonprofit organizations that are going to be responsible for that ownership and that stewardship. We know we're a city of renters, 78% of people rent. And so to talk about what it means to own, I mean, there's work actually by a professor at Princeton that's very influential with me on this, that you can't just put people into an oppressive market and expect a just outcome, right? So just giving people more access to a predatory loan is not actually creating intergenerational wealth. So, I mean, I think to the extent that we can transform the way we understand economic development to be real community wealth creation, we're putting ourselves in a stronger position to fight displacement and fight the trends that we know are going to come in and displace. So I don't know how closely linked that is to the violence prevention ecosystem that we were talking about, but I hope, I mean, I see it that way, that it's like to the extent people have prosperity in place, then we're sort of using prosperity to drive out violence and drive out the factors that cause violence.
Great, thank you. Lakeisha or Eddie, do you want to address that? Okay, I'll go to the next question then. You each represent profound shifts within your respective organizations. What needs to happen to see a broader shift in philanthropy?
So I wouldn't, well, let's say, I have a couple of thoughts around this. The first, I would say, I'm very curious, how many folks here have done or are currently doing like street outreach work or direct service work? Just curious. That means like themselves, like going into the communities and hotspots. Okay. All right. So here's how I come at this question. Every opportunity that I've had to be in leadership and hire people, I have hired intentionally, and I have negotiated when I was. By the way, I never applied for any of my jobs. I've always got recruited, which is a good thing. And every job that I did recruit, I got denied because of my background. So it's interesting. But I would say that what I've negotiated, I've never really negotiated for salary. I negotiated, like, in my position, can I hire who I want to hire? So building, equity in a community, for example, is recognizing that there's so much talent, right, in our communities. And sometimes we don't invest in that talent. And so, so we don't do that, then how in the world do we expect our communities to change? How do we expect for them to get paid more money? How do we expect them to bridge them to things that they might not necessarily be aware, or inspire them to go back to school and so on? So in these roles that I've played, I have done that very intentionally. And in my last role, I'm happy to say that 2 of a small staff that I had are actually in philanthropy now. One's at the Joyce Foundation, and another one is at the Staines Family Foundation, doing this kind of work now. People with lived experience, people who grew up in the hood. So it makes a huge difference. And so the questions that I often ask is like, the agencies that we report to, philanthropy, right, who is giving, are we also being intentional to look at our EDs, the CEOs, to say, what are you doing to build equity with the staff that you're hiring? How are you investing in their development so that you have a career trajectory for them as well, right? So that's really important, because too often you have someone like myself who tells a story and people are like, oh man, that's kind of compelling, right? And you become the token. In my position, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to be the token, which brings me to your question as well. At the Department of Justice, we have several fellows who have very similar experience than I do in the justice system and in the streets. And our hope is to continue to expand it, but our hope is also to hire career folks in this space. So this is what the Department of Justice is committing to. This is how we're thinking about equity. This is how we're thinking about bridging, right, the work that we're doing with community, because we need your insight in the inside. And so the last thing that I'll say around this is that while right now you might only have 1 social worker per 10 officers, right, it's something to really celebrate, but it's not enough for us to settle, right? You know, you're playing the inside game. And part of playing the inside game is that you have some folks, and we need these folks to be radical when they're thinking and radical when they're approached, right? And to demonstrate and protest around these things. And then we need our other, counterparts, right, who are in the inside to continue to push that along, right? To kind of what Walter mentioned earlier about the policies and so on. Like, how do we continue to inch our way in there, right? It's a long-term game, but this requires the folks who are in this room and those who are not in this room as well.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I'm going to have to wrap it up. But again, so much thanks and appreciation for each of you. Fortunately, we have lunch next, so you can have an opportunity to have conversations with the panelists. And again, also want to just thank Equal Justice USA for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this panel. Thank you very much.